Dear friends, do you know how the gospel entered China? Do you know how many missionaries lived in China? Do you know what pushed them forward? Do you know the hearts beating inside them as they sacrificed themselves one after another? Do you know what they actually did in this foreign land and what it means to you? Today, they will tell us. The human race is a tree with civilization at its branches. While they grow in all directions, they share a common root. This is why all civilizations share the dream of finding their roots. China is no exception. Since the first Chinese emperor, there has always been a Taoist tradition of revering heaven, often through elaborate rituals. Even as the Taoist tradition diminished, people would still cry out to the heavens when faced with pain and suffering, revealing an unwavering pursuit of their roots. The historian Arnold Toynbee viewed history as a dialogue between man and God. Man calls out to God, and God responds to man. Around AD 1, the miracle of the virgin birth brought Jesus into the world. Through his extraordinary wisdom, sacrificial love, and mighty power, culminating in his resurrection, he confirmed that he was, and is, the Son of God. His disciples were confident that he was the source of life, long awaited by the Jewish people, sought after by all. Before his ascension, Jesus commissioned his disciples to go forth and proclaim the gospel throughout the planet. Trials of blood and fire began to engulf the world. In the year 64 AD, around 30 years after Jesus' ascension, Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. Six years later, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Christians were forced to flee. One of Jesus' 12 disciples, St. Thomas, traveled to India, and it is said that he evangelized as far as China. In southwestern India lies the Malabar coast, and there, in a Syriac Nestorian breviary, it is written, "By St. Thomas the Chinese also with the Ethiopians have turned to truth. By St. Thomas has flown and gone up the kingdom of the height among the Chinese." The Jesuit priest Matteo strongly believed that St. Thomas reached China. He wrote in his biography that St. Thomas is the one who brought Christianity to China. If this is true, then Christianity may have reached China as early as 1st century AD during the Han Dynasty. However, we can only consider this as a legend, as there is little historical evidence to support it. Another legend, that the Nestorian Christian church entered China in the Tang dynasty, became established as historical fact with the unearthing of a stone tablet in 1625. This precious artifact is extremely well preserved. Today, it can be found in the Steel Forest Museum in Xi'an. Since the Han Dynasty, the Great Qin refers to the Roman Empire. The tablet also mentions the luminous religion, meaning the Nestorian Church. This ever-true and unchanging way is mysterious and almost impossible to name, but its exemplary operations are so brilliantly manifested that we make an effort and call it the luminous religion. After Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, some believers followed Nestorianism. It argued for the separation of Jesus' divine and human personae, believing that the Virgin Mary should be referred to as Christ-bearer rather than God-bearer. In 431 AD, the First Council of Ephesus condemned Nestorianism as heretical, and so the Nestorians relocated to the east and eventually entered China as the luminous religion. What may seem at first glance to be purely coincidental is, just as Christianity was traveling east to enter China, the Chinese were journeying west in search of sacred texts. It is unclear when these legends of sacred texts in the West and the Western paradise began moving through the hearts of those in the East. In 629 AD, a Buddhist monk, Xuanzang, left Chang'an and traveled west to India. 17 years later, he returned with 657 Buddhist texts. However, the Pure Lands in the West that the Amitabha Sutra describes obviously do not refer to India itself. Xuanzang should have kept journeying farther west. As if it were meant to be, 6 years after Xuanzang stopped in India in his journey west for sacred texts, Bishop Alopan brought the Bible from the west to Chang'an. This was the golden age of the Tang dynasty, a time of tolerance and prosperity. Following a personal welcome by Chancellor Fang Xuanling, Alopan was granted an audience with Emperor Taizun, then arranged for him to enter the imperial library and begin translating the Bible. 3 years later, Emperor Taizun declared that Christianity contained truths beneficial for both individuals and society as a whole, and proclaimed that it should be disseminated across the land. He funded the building of a Nestorian church called the Great Qin Monastery, housing 21 priests in the Yining quarters of Chang'an.
In the Mugao caves of Dunhuang, Sir Arnold Stein discovered a silk painting. Though there is significant deterioration, we see a person in the painting who is crowned and holding a scepter. On the scepter there is a cross. On his forehead there is another cross. It is considered a Nestorian silk painting.
By the time Emperor Duozong ordered the Nestorian tablet to be erected in 781 AD, the Nestorian Church had been active in China for over 140 years.
Nestorian manuscripts use considerable amount of Buddhist and Taoist terminology. Although these words are simply borrowed, the manuscripts clearly reflect Nestorian Christianity. The manuscripts mention the Great Qin Monastery, which is actually a Nestorian church. The manuscripts use phrases like triune to refer to the Christian Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Aloha is the Syriac term for God, and Mishihu means Messiah or Jesus Christ. Pure wind is divinity, or what we call the Holy Spirit. The Nestorian tablet states, having designed all things, he then created the first man. It describes precisely the Christian creation narrative. A virgin gave birth to the Holy One, clearly referring to Saint Mary giving birth to Jesus. The manuscript writes, appointing the cross to determine the 4 cardinal points to describe the crucifixion of Jesus. Ascended to his true station refers to the ascension. 27 sacred books have been left. Most people believe that this refers to the 27 books of the New Testament.
With these examples and others, it is apparent that while the fundamentals of Christianity were introduced, there were limits to its influence. Christianity in China still depended on Buddhism and imperial power. In 845 AD, Emperor Wuzong ordered the persecution of Buddhism, which spread to Nestorian Christianity. Churches were destroyed, priests were banished, and the Nestorian tablet was buried. The next time the gospel would come knocking on China's door would 5 centuries later, in the Yuan dynasty. This time, it had to do with the famous Marco Polo. In 1362, Zhu Yuanzhang led his Ming armies into Quanzhou, killing the bishop. Several years later, the Christianity of the Yuan dynasty was all but extinct. "200 years later, at the turn of the 16th century, 2 major events happened. One was the Reformation led by Martin Luther, resulting in a strong spiritual awakening and renewed focus in spreading the gospel. The other event was the successful voyages of global circumnavigation by Ferdinand Magellan and Christopher Columbus, connecting the world as one. The messengers of God once again embarked on a journey, this time by sea, to knock on China's door. The Jesuits gathered a group of volunteers willing to lay down their lives for the gospel. The first to come to China was the Spanish Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier. He stayed in Japan for 27 months.
When he was in Japan, he discovered that the Japanese revered the Chinese. The Japanese would often learn and emulate what the Chinese did. Japanese culture had a strong link to Chinese culture.
The Japanese, you know what they said? It's strange that you speak of how great Jesus Christ is. But the Chinese have never told us about him. So Xavier thought to himself, I should go to China. then Chinese can tell Japanese that there is a Jesus Christ, so that they will believe.
以后中国人就是要给日本人说，这有过一个耶稣基督 OK， 他们才信。
With a strong interest in and respect for Chinese culture, Xavier set sail for China in 1552 and arrived at Shangchuan Island, just 8 nautical miles from the mainland, near Taishan, Guangdong. No one was willing to break the law and take him to the mainland. He died from a fever at the age of 46. Through his last words, he strongly believed that the holy name of Jesus Christ would enter China. 26 years after Xavier died, another Jesuit missionary, the Italian Alessandro Valignano, arrived in Macau. Facing China, this large, closed, impenetrable piece of land, he cried out, "O rock, rock, when wilt thou open?" Even though Valignano was never able to enter China, he was confident that China would be convinced to accept some foreigners of strong intellect and moral standing.
At the time, the Jesuits were growing quickly. They sent their best and smartest members to China.
Four years later, in 1582, Valignano's student Matteo Ricci arrived. Accompanied by his classmate Michel Ruggieri, Ricci visited Zhaoqing. The governor, Wang Pan, welcomed them and presented them with 2 plaques for their house and church: Pure Land from the West and Heavenly Flower Temple. With a strong sense of mission and passion for China, Ricci immersed himself in the ancient Chinese classics while traveling around the country, personally experiencing local customs and culture.
Ricci came to China. He believed, I am a member of the clergy. I should dress and look like Chinese clergy. The religious figures he met were Buddhist monks. For 10 years he shaved his head and wore the clothes of Buddhist monks. When he discovered that the people really respected scholars instead of monks, he started dressing like a Confucian scholar. He let others know that he was a scholar and started exchanging ideas with other scholars. He soon made many friends among the scholars.
After living like this for 19 years, Ricci finally amassed enough goodwill from the Chinese to become a foreigner of strong intellect and moral standing. In 1601, Ricci finally received permission to enter Beijing.
Unlike other missionaries who tried to impose Christianity on top of Chinese culture, Ricci believed that there were certain seeds within the culture. He wanted to discover elements within Chinese culture that were compatible with the truth of Jesus Christ and start from there. He felt that the teachings of Confucius and faith in Jesus Christ were compatible and could work together in many areas. The Confucian ethics and values of respecting others and revering the heavens were all acceptable.
He would quote the classic Confucian text, "The doctrine of the mean." The ceremonies of sacrifices to heaven and earth are meant for the service of the sovereign on high. He believed that the sovereign on high, worshipped by the ancient Chinese, was God. On the basis of Ruggieri's The Veritable Record of the Lord of Heaven, Ricci wrote the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven. He tried to incorporate Chinese cultural leanings while providing a clear and concise introduction to Catholic theology. This is another important point. Ricci and others were not only devoted priests, but also distinguished scholars. Ricci brought the eye-opening diorama, chiming clock, sundial, and world map to China. He introduced Western hydraulics, artillery, astronomy, music, and perspective drawing to the Chinese. He wrote and translated dozens of texts to Chinese, including astronomy, surveying, geometry, arithmetic, Western ethics, culture, and philosophy. Under the influence of missionaries such as Ricci, Lazzaro Cataneo, and Joao de Roca, some Ming Dynasty ministers, including Xu Guangqi, Li Shuisao, and Yang Tinwen, were baptized. Xu Guangqi was the Grand Imperial Secretary. He was the first national leader of China who was both scientifically literate and of the Christian faith.
徐光启一直在问问题啊。
Zhu Guangji was always asking questions and hoping to absorb Western knowledge. Ricci told him, if you don't understand Euclid's elements, you might not be able to understand Western science and knowledge because Western logic is different from Chinese logic.
中国的逻辑不一样啊，所以徐光启就下了决心，他要学习集合原本，而且会愿意帮助。
Zhu decided to study elements and helped Ricci translate it into Chinese.
他是农夫，他常常会遇到一些自然灾害，这老百姓会受苦。
He was a farmer and often encountered natural disasters that caused suffering. He wanted to understand how to solve these practical problems. Through the missionaries, he learned and taught people how to grow crops less likely to fail, such as tomatoes and peanuts.
这种学问啊，累积起来好多年，最后他写了一本非常有影响。
He accumulated this type of knowledge for many years and wrote the influential comprehensive book, Complete Treatise on Agricultural Administration. Some say that through this treatise and his many years of research, Xi began a green revolution, increasing the population of China.
人口增加。徐光启跟利玛窦
Xi and Ricci are inextricably intertwined. If there were no Xi, there probably would be no Ricci, at least not a Ricci with such large contributions. On the other hand, if there were no Ricci, Xi's contributions would probably also be smaller. Ricci should be one of our Catholic saints, but we also feel that Xi should accompany him as a saint because their collaboration is indisputable.
Xu said, if my countrymen could fear God, serve God, would we not be able to revive the age of the sage emperors? In 1616, the Nanjing Church incident occurred. Allegations were made against the missionaries.
偶尔反对这些传教士不能够接受耶稣的。
Those opposed to missionaries and unable to accept faith in Jesus spread rumors, accusations, and even formal charges against the missionaries. Every time this happened, Xi Guangji used his own life as a guarantee. He defended the innocent and good character of the missionaries and offered to be punished alongside them if they were found otherwise.
真的是有问题，他自己愿意跟他们一起受苦，一起有同样的一个结果啊。
Together with Ricci, government official Li Shuichao translated 2 mathematical textbooks into Chinese and edited a multi-volume anthology on the fundamentals of Catholicism. Li had concubines. Ricci refused to baptize him until Li finally chose to separate from them at the age of 46. Imperial Inspector Yang Tinwen was originally Buddhist. After conversion into Christianity, he was criticized by the Buddhist community. He responded, Christianity is first and foremost the worship of God, and secondly, the loving of neighbors as oneself. This is completely in line with Confucian teachings. In the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, Catholicism and the Chinese government went through a rare honeymoon phase. German missionary Johann Adam Shaw von Bell was made the director of the Imperial Observatory. During the reign of the Qing Emperor Shun Zhi, responsible for reforming the calendar. As a close friend of Emperor, Shaul was exempt from court formalities. When the first European-style church was completed in Beijing, Emperor Shunzhi presented it with a plaque inscribed with the words, "Spiritual Realm."
Emperor Shunzhi was very ill with smallpox when he was young. At his deathbed, Shunzhi asked Shaul for advice about who should be the next emperor. Shaul told him it would be best to select someone who had already survived smallpox and was therefore immune. That emperor was Kangxi.
After Shunzhi died, government official Yang Guangxun led an attack against the missionaries. He claimed that foreigners could not be trusted. It would be better to have poor calendars than to have Westerners in China. At the time, Kangxi was only 8. The regent minister, Boy, believed in the various accusations and imprisoned Shaul, Ferdinand Verbiest, and other missionaries. The following year, Shaul was sentenced to a brutal death. The other missionaries were beaten and exiled. Shaul was an elderly man when he was imprisoned. He soon suffered a stroke and was unable to speak. When he was beaten and interrogated, his assistant, Verbiest, would help answer. According to Qing records, on April 13, 1665, a meteor appeared. At 11 on the morning of the 16th, as the death sentence was handed to Kangxi and Grand Empress Dowager Xia Zhuang, an earthquake struck the Forbidden City and darkness fell over Beijing. The government officials were terrified. The Empress Dowager immediately revoked this sentence and released Shaul and the others. Shaul passed away at the age of 75 and was buried next to Ricci in Beijing. Their names were written into the history of Ming and the history of Qing. Their lives belonged to their beloved China.
Did you
know that of the missionaries Jesuits sent to Asia, only 1/3 would be alive after 5 years? Yes, for Jesuits. If we sent 6 people over, we knew that only 2 would remain 5 years later. The other 4 would be gone.
The precocious Kangxi took control of the government and summoned both the anti-Christianity official Yang Guangxian and the missionary Verbiest to the observatory to predict various astronomical phenomena. Verbiest was accurate on all accounts, while Yang failed every task. Kangxi immediately installed Verbiest as the new director of the Imperial Observatory, ordered solemn funeral ceremonies for Shaul, exiled Yang, and imprisoned Boy. From then on, Kangxi and Verbiest became close friends. Based on Verbiest's memoirs and history of the 2 Tartar conquerors of China, whenever Kangxi was unhappy, seeing Verbiest would immediately brighten his mood. On March 22, 1692, Kangxi issued an edict listing the contributions of missionaries to China and granted them freedom to evangelize. Kangxi even made a personal appearance at the Xuanwu Gate Church, presenting them with 2 plaques, Revere Heaven and True Origin of All Things. He also composed poetry to praise Jesus. When the work on the cross was finished, blood formed a creek. Grace from the west flowed 1,000 yards deep. Heaven's gate was closed due to the first man's sin. The entire path to salvation is through the Son. I am willing to accept the Holy Son of God, and as I become His Son, may receive His gift of eternity.
These are the emperor's words. Other documents state when he writes heaven, we know what he means. When he writes heaven, This is not a casual choice of wording. His view of heaven is closer to what we call the creator of all things, the one true God, right?
比较接近就是我们所说的创造万有的唯一的一个真神，对不对？
They didn't use current Chinese Catholic terms back then. They had their own terminology, specific to their time. So they used their own terminology to explain. After that, they would say, okay, you could use the term.
他解释以后说 OK， 那么 OK， 这个你就可以放在那边的。万有真源或者就是
True origin of all things. You can go analyze those words. They aren't heretical. Any Christian, unless you start nitpicking, then you can nitpick.
At the time, the missionaries translated dozens of classic Western scientific works and helped China fabricate hundreds of canon. Every day, Kang Shi would ask for Biest and two other missionaries, Tomas Pereira and Domingo Fernandez Navarrete, to come to the palace and teach for 2 to 3 hours, covering topics such as astronomy, geography, music, art, anatomy, and medicine. The classes were never interrupted, even when they left Beijing to visit other palaces. Pereira and Jean-François Gerbion helped Emperor Kangxi negotiate China's first peace treaty, the Treaty of Nerchinsk, with Russia's Peter the Great. Emperor Kangxi promised in the name of God to abide by the terms of the treaty. Some years after Verbiest died, the honeymoon phase between the Catholic Church and the Qing dynasty ended. The Catholic Church suffered. The Qing dynasty steadily worsened. From 1645 onwards, the Holy See became concerned with the purity of faith in China, reaffirming God cannot be translated as Shangdi and must be called Deus. Churches could not have plaques with inscriptions like Revere Heaven. Christians could not participate in rites for Confucius or worship ancestors. Classical Chinese texts could not be praised, etc. Kangxi explained that Shangdi is precisely the Christian God. The use of heaven was not for the physical heaven. Rites for Confucius and ancestors were not religious in nature, but expressions of respect, and not in conflict with Christianity.
When you just arrived in China, how much did you understand China? You might not even know how to speak Mandarin, but you would come and say, you can't burn incense here because it's idolatry. You were baptized. Why do you still worship your ancestors? Even to the missionaries, some would say, you're not doing your job properly. You're working for the devil. This is heretical. In Europe, we place flowers on graves. Is this because the person buried there still had a nose that could smell their fragrance?
The Pope sent the 34-year-old Bishop Charles Thomas Maliard du Tournon to China, threatening Chinese Christians with excommunication. Kangxi ordered for his immediate expulsion. The Pope then sent Bishop Carlo Ambrosio Mezzabarba to China. Kangxi met with him 13 times. When Kangxi finally read papal documents which held no room for compromise, he responded as follows: "How can we speak to those narrow-minded Westerners about the grand principles of China? From now on, the Westerners may no longer practice their religion. It is now banned to avoid further trouble."
The tragedy was because of the Catholic Church. It had nothing to do with China. Kangxi was incredibly supportive of Catholicism. In the end, Kangxi had no choice. He could not obey what the Holy See ordered him to do. If others wanted him to obey the orders, they had to leave China. Kangxi ordered the Catholics to leave.
我觉得当时候康熙跟基督教关系是心想，当时是不是真的是？
I think Kangxi's relationship with Christianity was one of mutual respect and admiration. Whether or not the relationship went deeper, whether Kangxi actually became a Christian, I think there was still some distance. While Kangxi accepted different perspectives and religions, he would still place them within Chinese traditions. He maintained stability by not allowing new ideas to challenge China's imperial power and social customs. If others agreed and submitted to his conditions, if they could work with him, then it didn't matter what they believed. If others challenged things, they would shake the foundations of his sovereignty. I think that the controversy of rights was really a breach of an unspoken agreement and mutual understanding.
In 1724, 4 years after Kangxi banned Christianity, Emperor Yongjung decreed that all Christians were to reject their faith or face capital punishment. All missionaries were given half a year to leave the country. Over 300,000 Christians were persecuted. 300 churches were seized. Over 50 missionaries either went into hiding or escaped.
那么到底这个是谁的错啊？
Whose fault was it? Was the Holy See too arrogant? Or the emperor too stubborn? Was it the fault of the people or the will of God? People must decide for themselves.
每一个人都要做自己的一个判断啊。不过啊，最近
But recently, the Holy See decided the Church bore a large responsibility. It was too demanding and not understanding enough of Chinese culture.
太硬，太不了解中国文化。
If Chinese Christians followed the Holy See, they would not be able to participate in ancestral rites and imperial examinations. They would be considered ungrateful children and inferior citizens. If they followed Kangxi and continued to worship their ancestors, they would have defied Christian doctrine. At the time, being a good Chinese and a good Christian seemed as incompatible as water and fire. Under these circumstances, God made the best choices. Afterwards, China went through the May 4th movement, the Cultural Revolution, the economic reform, and various other assaults. To be a good Chinese today, one no longer has to disobey the Christian faith. Instead, we need the Christian faith. We can exclaim, God's decisions are always best. From the Nestorian Church in the Tang Dynasty, Erkuiner Archaeum in the Yuan Dynasty, to Catholicism in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, spanning over 1,000 years, time and time again, knocking, opening, and closing doors. Over and over again, sowing, sprouting, and removing seeds, all the longing, hoping, and disappointing moments. None of it was in vain. All of it represents God's grace. Through their self-sacrificing devotion to China, we see God's unconditional love for the Chinese people. From each successive wave of attempts, we see God's determination to be with the Chinese people. Through each success and failure, we see God meticulously mapping out a path to the gospel, one completely tailored for the Chinese people. In 1807, 100 years after the Chinese rights controversy between the Holy See and the Qing government, Robert Morrison, Hudson Taylor, and many other missionaries, through blood and tears, sowed the seeds of the gospel at the lowest levels of Chinese society. This time, the door to China's soul was opened. It was never closed again.
天上飘着些微云，地上吹着些微风，微风吹动了我头发， 叫我如何不像他？
想